A young woman raised in a strict settler family is torn between loyalty to her kin and a love that could cost her everything. Asterisk. Before starting the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us where you're watching from in the comments. Asterisk. The boundary was not drawn with ink on a map, nor marked with fences or stones. It existed in the whispered warnings of mothers, in the stern lectures of fathers, and in the ever-present fear that hung over the small settlement like a storm cloud waiting to break. For Eleanor Whitfield, 17 years old and restless at heart, the boundary was a prison she had been born into. The Whitfield family had traveled west 5 years earlier, leaving behind the comforts of Virginia for the promise of fertile land and independence. Her father, Jonathan, was a man of strict principles, hardened by the hardships of frontier life. He believed survival depended on order, obedience, and vigilance. Eleanor's mother, Abigail, enforced his will in the household with the same stern resolve, ensuring her daughters stitched, cooked, and prayed according to God's law. But Eleanor often found herself staring past the edges of their cleared fields toward the dark line of the forest where the Apache people lived unseen. To her parents, that forest was a place of terror, home to raiders who struck in the night, burning cabins and carrying off livestock. To Eleanor, it was a place of mystery, wild and unclaimed, humming with secrets she longed to understand. Her curiosity had always set her apart. While her sisters spoke excitedly about marriage prospects with the sons of neighboring settlers, Eleanor found herself recoiling at the thought of binding her life to a man who measured his worth only in acres and cattle. The frontier was supposed to be a land of freedom, yet her life felt narrower with each passing year, hemmed in by duty and fear. Every evening, as the sun sank behind the jagged hills, Eleanor's father would gather the family around the hearth and remind them of the dangers beyond their fields. His voice was grave, each word meant to brand itself upon their minds. Never stray beyond the river. The Apache watch from the trees. They are cunning, ruthless, and merciless. God help the soul who trusts them. Eleanor would lower her gaze dutifully, but inside her heart rebelled. She wondered if her father's words were the whole truth, or if they were only stories passed down to justify walls that kept more than enemies out. They kept her own spirit confined. The settlers' fear was not unfounded. Stories of raids traveled fast across the frontier. Men spoke of sudden attacks at dawn, of arrows whistling through the air, of cabins reduced to ash. Yet Eleanor could not ignore the contradictions. She had once glimpsed an Apache woman at a distance, carrying a child across the riverbank. The woman's stride was proud, her back unbent beneath the weight. She had looked not like a monster, but like a mother, flesh and blood as real as Abigail Whitfield. That memory had unsettled Eleanor, quietly dismantling the neat lines between us and them that her father drew so fiercely. Life in the settlement left little time for rebellion, however. Each day dawned with chores: milking cows, feeding chickens, grinding corn into meal. Eleanor's hands were calloused, her skin browned from the sun, yet her spirit still strained against the monotony. She often stole small moments of solitude when she could, lingering by the river under the pretense of fetching water, or climbing the gentle rise beyond the cornfield to watch the horizon. From there, she could see where the fields ended and the wilderness began. It was on one such day, standing at that invisible border, that she first felt the stirrings of fate. The forest loomed before her, green and shadowed, whispering promises she could not yet name. Something inside her insisted that her life story would not be written entirely within the narrow lines her family had drawn, and yet the price of stepping beyond those lines was steep. Eleanor knew the consequences of disobedience all too well. Her father's temper was swift, his punishments unyielding. But a deeper fear tugged at her, that by obeying, she might lose something far greater, her chance to live a life of her own choosing. That evening, As the family gathered for supper, Eleanor's thoughts lingered on the horizon. Her mother asked her to bow her head in prayer. Her sisters chattered about the Sunday service, and her father spoke of reinforcing the barn. But Eleanor remained quiet, her spoon idle in her hand. She thought of the forest, of the unseen lives that moved within it, and of the boundary that divided their worlds. The settlers feared that crossing it meant death. Eleanor feared that never crossing it would mean never truly living. The river marked the edge of Eleanor's world. Beyond its winding current lay the shadowed forest her father had forbidden her to enter. Yet the river itself was safe, or at least, that was what she told herself whenever she lingered longer than she should. On that particular afternoon, the air was heavy with the heat of late summer. The cicadas buzzed lazily, and the water glimmered in the sunlight, sliding past smooth stones. Eleanor carried a wooden bucket, intending to fill it quickly before her mother noticed her absence. But she did not hurry. She knelt at the bank, trailing her fingers in the cool water, savoring the fleeting sense of freedom. It was then she felt it, that prickling awareness that she was not alone. She stilled, her hand hovering just above the river's surface. Slowly, she lifted her gaze. On the opposite bank stood a young man, her breath caught in her throat. He was tall, his posture straight, his bare chest painted with the ochre of his people. His dark hair, bound with leather at the crown, glinted in the sun. He carried a bow slung across his back, and his eyes sharp, steady, were fixed on her. An Apache. Her father's warnings rushed into her mind. They are merciless. They are watching. They will take what they want. Fear surged through her chest, urging her to flee. And yet, she did not move. Something in the young man's gaze held her fast. For a long, breathless moment, the river was the only thing between them. Neither spoke. Eleanor felt the wild hammering of her heart, as though her body itself understood the danger she was in. But the man did not raise his weapon, nor did he call out to others who might be hidden in the trees. Instead, his expression shifted, curiosity flickered in his dark eyes. Eleanor swallowed hard, clutching the handle of her bucket. She should have turned, should have run back to the safety of her family's land. Instead, she whispered the first word that rose unbidden to her lips. "Hello." Her voice was barely more than a breath, carried on the river's murmur. She had no idea if he understood her. But to her astonishment, the warrior tilted his head slightly, as though considering her courage. Then he spoke, his voice deep and measured. "You should not be here." His English was accented but clear. Eleanor's eyes widened so he understood her tongue. The words themselves were a warning, but there was no malice in them. She found her voice again, though it trembled. "And neither should you." The corners of his mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but something close. For the briefest instant, the fear that had gripped her loosened its hold. He took a single step closer to the water's edge. Eleanor's pulse quickened. He was near enough now that she could see the faint scar running along his forearm, could notice the eagle feather tied at his shoulder. Everything about him radiated strength and pride, yet also restraint. "Why do you watch me?" she asked, surprising herself with her own boldness. "Because you watch the forest," he replied simply. "Most of your people keep their eyes down. You look beyond." Eleanor felt heat rush to her cheeks. How long had he seen her here? How many times had he been the shadow she imagined in the trees? A strange shiver of both dread and wonder rippled through her. She wanted to ask his name, but before she could speak, a distant voice carried across the fields her brother calling for her. Eleanor stiffened. She turned her head toward the sound, panic rushing in. When she looked back across the river, the warrior was gone. The forest stood silent, concealing him as though he had never been there. Eleanor's hands shook as she filled her bucket and hurried home. Her brother scolded her for dawdling, but she barely heard him. Her mind was far away, back at the river, replaying every detail of the encounter. That night, as her family ate supper by lamplight, Eleanor sat quietly, her heart still racing. She could hear her father's warnings echoing in her head, each one now tangled with the memory of the young man's eyes. They were not merciless. They were not empty of feeling. They were alive, searching, just as her own were, for the first time. Eleanor wondered if the boundary her family feared so deeply was not meant to keep her safe, but to keep her blind dot, and in the secret corners of her heart, she hoped against reason, against fear, that she would see him again. For days after that first encounter, Eleanor could not shake the image of the warrior by the river. His eyes, steady and unafraid, lingered in her memory even as she scrubbed laundry or chopped vegetables beneath her mother's watchful gaze. At night, she lay awake listening to the sounds of the wilderness, the cry of an owl, the rustle of branches in the wind, and wondered if he was out there in the darkness. Thinking of her as she thought of him, her life carried on with its same duties, the same sermons, the same lectures about obedience and danger. But everything felt changed. The air tasted sharper, the colors of the forest seemed brighter, as if the world beyond her family's boundary line had come alive. She told no one about what she had seen, not even her sisters, who whispered every secret between them. Could be trusted with this. It was a week before she saw him again. Eleanor had gone to the river, under the excuse of gathering wild herbs. She searched the banks carefully, pretending to study the plants, but her heart was listening for something else. Footsteps, the faint snap of a twig. When at last she felt that familiar awareness prickle along her spine, she turned slowly, as if she had expected him all along. He stood half-hidden among the trees, watching her. This time he did not wait for her to speak. He crossed the shallow stones and came to her side of the river. Eleanor's breath caught, but she did not run. Instead, she held his gaze, both terrified and exhilarated at her own daring. "You came back," she whispered. "You knew I would," he said simply. There was no arrogance in his tone, only certainty. He studied her with the same careful intensity as before, as though trying to read her heart. She noticed his name carved faintly into the handle of his bow, Dakota. She dared to say it aloud, letting the syllables roll gently from her tongue. He seemed surprised, then nodded once in approval. "Dakota," he confirmed. Eleanor pressed a hand to her chest. Eleanor. So began the first of many secret meetings. At first, they spoke little. Language was a barrier, though he knew more English than she expected. Slowly, piece by piece, their words grew into conversations. Dakota told her about his people's ways, about hunting under the stars, about the songs his mother used to sing when the fires burned low. He spoke of freedom, of walking wherever the wind carried him, of never bowing to chains of fear. Eleanor, in turn, told him about her family, about the strictness of her father, about how her sisters lived only for marriage and reputation. She admitted her longing for more than the small life laid out before her. Dakota listened closely, his dark eyes steady, as though her voice carried truths worth guarding. They met always in secret, sometimes beneath the silver wash of moonlight, sometimes in the hush of dawn when the world was still half asleep. Eleanor would slip away with excuses, a walk for berries, a need for water, and each time her heart raced with the risk of being caught. But in those stolen hours, she felt alive. Once, Dakota placed a wildflower in her hand, its petals crimson as fire. "This blooms where the sun touches the mountain," he told her. "Strong, untamed, like you." Her cheeks flushed, and for a moment she forgot the dangers surrounding them. His voice carried no flattery, only honesty, and that honesty stirred something deep within her. Another time, when thunder rumbled in the distance, they sheltered together beneath the broad boughs of a cottonwood tree. Eleanor found herself laughing as the rain swept in sudden sheets, soaking her skirts and plastering his hair to his brow. Dakota laughed too, a warm, deep sound that echoed through the storm. It was then, in that shared moment of wild joy, that she realized how natural it felt to stand beside him. As if some unspoken law of the universe had placed them there, side by side, against the rain. Yet even as their bond deepened, shadows grew around them. Eleanor knew the risks, her father's wrath, her brother's suspicion, the settlement's hatred for the Apache. If discovered, their meetings would not be forgiven. Dakota knew it too. More than once he warned her, "If your people find us, they will call you traitor. If mine find us, they will say I have forgotten my duty." Still, neither of them stopped, because between the words, in the quiet silences when their eyes met, something larger than fear held them together. Something Eleanor was only beginning to name. Love. The river no longer marked the boundary of her world. It had become the place where her world began. Autumn crept slowly across the land, painting the fields in gold and crimson. The harvest kept the settlement busy, but it also brought with it longer nights, colder winds, and sharper suspicions. Eleanor continued to slip away to the river whenever she could, her excuses carefully chosen and her timing exact. Each secret meeting with Dakota became more precious, but also more perilous. She knew she was walking a razor's edge. One misstep and the fragile world they had built could collapse. Her brother, Thomas, was the first to notice her absences. Thomas was 20, broad-shouldered, and fiercely loyal to their father. He had inherited Jonathan Whitfield's sternness, and his eyes often searched for weakness in those around him. One afternoon, as Eleanor returned from the river with a bundle of herbs, Thomas stepped into her path. "You've been wandering again," he said, his voice edged with suspicion. "Mother says you've been gone longer each day. What do you do out there?" Eleanor forced her face into calmness, though her pulse raced. "I gather what we need. Roots for medicine. Leaves for tea. Do you doubt my word?" Thomas narrowed his eyes. "I doubt your sense. Father warned us all. There are eyes in those woods, Ellie. Apache eyes. If they catch you," he broke off, his jaw tightening, "you would shame this family, or worse." The weight of his words pressed heavily on her chest. Eleanor lowered her gaze, letting her silence pass for obedience. But inside, her heart cried out, for it was already too late. Her shame, as Thomas would call it, was sealed the moment she had first spoken Dakota's name. That night, around the hearth, rumors spread like sparks. A neighboring cabin had been raided. Chickens stolen, tools taken, and arrows left behind as warning. The settlers muttered darkly, their voices heavy with anger and fear. Eleanor listened, her spoon frozen halfway to her mouth, her thoughts racing to Dakota. Had he been there? Had his bow been among those raised in violence? When the settlers spoke of the Apache, they used only words of hatred: savages, thieves, demons. Yet when Eleanor thought of Dakota, she saw not a monster but a man with laughter in his voice and kindness in his eyes. The contradiction tore at her soul, leaving her caught between two worlds that refused to touch. In the days that followed, Thomas grew watchful. Eleanor felt his gaze upon her whenever she lingered near the edge of the fields. Once, when she rose early to fetch water, he followed her halfway to the river before she realized it. She had to turn back, her chest burning with frustration, unable to keep her promise to Dakota. Their next meeting came at great risk. Eleanor waited until her family was distracted with the butchering of hogs, then slipped quietly into the trees. Her skirts caught on briars, and every snapping twig seemed louder than thunder, but at last she reached the riverbank. Dakota was already there, waiting. The look in his eyes told her he knew the danger was mounting. "They suspect," she whispered. He nodded. "Your brother watches. He does not trust you." A pang of fear shot through her, sharper than any warning her father had ever given. "If they find us, Thomas will—" "I know," Dakota said. His voice was steady, but there was a shadow in his eyes. "They will call you traitor, and me." He let the words trail away. He did not need to finish. She knew what her people would do to him if he were caught. Silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken truths. For the first time, Eleanor felt the weight of what they were risking, not just stolen scoldings or punishments, but their very lives. Yet when Dakota reached for her hand, she did not pull away. His touch was warm, grounding, a reminder that in a world ruled by fear, they had found something pure. "Will you still come?" he asked softly. Eleanor swallowed hard. She thought of her father's warnings, her brother's suspicions, the hatred whispered around the hearth. She thought of the forest beyond the river, alive with mystery. And then she thought of him, the man who saw her not as a daughter to be controlled, but as a soul unchained. "Yes," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "I will always come." Above them, a crow cried out, its wings dark against the reddening sky. Eleanor shivered, uncertain whether it was an omen of doom or a herald of destiny. The first frost came early that year. The settlers rose to find the fields glazed white, the corn stalks brittle, the air sharp with the promise of winter. With the cold came tension so thick, Eleanor could feel it pressing against her chest. Talk of Apache raids spread through the settlement like wildfire. Chickens stolen, barns burned, hunting parties seen too near the fields. Eleanor listened in silence as her father and Thomas sharpened their rifles by lamplight. Their voices were grim, their eyes alight with a dangerous certainty. "They've grown bold," Jonathan Whitfield said, his jaw tight. "We'll strike first if we must. Better to send them running now than bury another neighbor." Eleanor's spoon slipped from her hand into the stew, but no one noticed. Her stomach twisted at his words. Strike first. Bury another neighbor. She thought of Dakota, of his laughter under the cottonwood tree, of the flower he had placed gently in her hand. He was no thief, no monster, yet the men at her table spoke as though he and all his people were nothing but targets. That night, Eleanor slipped away. The moon was high, casting pale silver over the land. Her breath misted in the air as she hurried to the river, every step pounding with dread. Dakota was waiting, but his expression was darker than she had ever seen it. "There will be fighting," he said without greeting. "Your people come into the woods with guns." "My people prepare to meet them." Eleanor's throat tightened. No, there must be another way. "They think," she faltered, "they think you are all savages. They think you are nothing like me." Dakota's jaw was set, his gaze fierce. "They bring war to us, Eleanor. Do you expect us to bow? To let them burn our homes? My people will fight, and I." His voice softened. "I will fight with them." Her heart broke at the certainty in his tone. She stepped closer, gripping his arm as if she could hold him back from the tide of violence. "If they see you, if they know my father, my brother, they will not spare you." Dakota's eyes softened, but he did not retreat. He touched her cheek gently, a gesture so tender it made her ache. "If I must fall, I fall with honor. But you," his voice grew urgent, "you must stay away. Promise me, Eleanor. Do not come to the forest when the fighting begins." She shook her head, tears burning in her eyes. "I cannot promise that. I cannot stand by and do nothing while they kill you." For the first time, he looked at her with frustration, even anger. "You do not understand what war is. It is not a game, Eleanor. It is blood. It is fire." "I know," she whispered. "But I also know you are more than the enemy they see. And if I cannot change their minds, then I will not abandon you." The silence between them was sharp, filled with things neither could change. Finally, Dakota drew her into his arms. She pressed her face against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart, memorizing it as though she feared it might be silenced. Days later, The clash came. It began at dawn, when gunfire cracked through the crisp air. Eleanor woke to the sound and rushed to the door. Smoke curled on the horizon, and shouts echoed across the fields. Her father and Thomas grabbed their rifles, faces grim with purpose. "Stay inside," her father barked. But Eleanor's feet moved before her mind could stop them. She fled toward the woods, skirts tangling in the frost-stiff grass, the acrid scent of smoke filling her lungs. When she reached the river, chaos raged beyond it. Settlers advanced with rifles, their shouts harsh and panicked. From the trees, Apache warriors answered with arrows, their cries sharp and fierce, and in the midst of it, she saw him, Dakota. His bow was raised, his movement swift and sure, every line of his body alive with strength. He looked like the warrior her father had always warned her of. Yet to Eleanor, he was still the man who had placed a flower in her hand. She stumbled forward, her voice tearing from her throat. "Dakota!" For a heartbeat, he froze, his eyes locking on hers across the battlefield. In that moment, the world seemed to pause, the smoke, the shouts, the clash of weapons all falling away. But then a gunshot rang out. Eleanor's scream caught in her throat as she saw Dakota stagger. The sound of the gunshot seemed to echo forever in Eleanor's ears. She saw Dakota stumble, clutching his arm, then vanish into the smoke of the battle. Before she could reach him, a rough hand seized her wrist. "Eleanor!" It was Thomas. His face was red with fury, his eyes wide with disbelief. "What in God's name are you doing out here?" She struggled, trying to pull free, desperate to follow where Dakota had gone. "He's hurt. I must." Her words only fueled his rage. He dragged her back from the riverbank, his grip bruising. "You're with them," he spat. "All this time you're sneaking off, you're wandering. You've been meeting an Apache." The truth was out. Eleanor's breath came in ragged gasps, not from running but from the crushing weight of realization. Her secret, the fragile thread she had guarded so carefully, had snapped. Thomas hauled her back to the settlement. The smoke of battle trailed behind them, the cries of men fading as they returned to the safety of the cabins. Villagers turned as they passed, whispering, their faces twisted with suspicion. Eleanor felt each stare like a blade to her skin. When Thomas shoved her through the cabin door, her father was waiting. Jonathan Whitfield rose slowly from his chair, his rifle resting against the wall. His eyes, cold and hard as iron, fixed on his daughter. "Explain," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Thomas did it for her. I found her at the river calling out for one of them. An Apache warrior. She's been sneaking off to meet him. God knows for how long." The room fell silent. Eleanor's mother gasped, pressing a hand to her mouth. Her sister shrank back, wide-eyed with shock. Eleanor stood trembling in the center, her heart pounding so loudly she could barely hear her own voice when she spoke. "It's true," she whispered. "His name is Dakota. He is not what you say he is. He's kind, and—" Her father's fist slammed onto the table, silencing her. "Enough," he thundered. His face was crimson, his veins bulging at his temples. "Do you understand what you've done? You've betrayed your family, your people. You've brought shame into this house." Tears blurred Eleanor's vision, but she stood her ground. "I love him," she said, the words breaking free at last. "And I will not deny it." The room erupted. Her sisters wailed, her mother wept openly, and Thomas cursed under his breath. Jonathan seized Eleanor by the arm, his grip like iron. "You are no daughter of mine," he growled. "You will not leave this house again. Better you rot inside these walls and consort with the enemy." He dragged her across the room and shoved her into the small storage chamber off the kitchen. The door slammed shut, the bolt sliding into place. Darkness enveloped her, and for the first time in her life, Eleanor was truly a prisoner. She pressed her forehead against the rough wood, sobs racking her body. Beyond the door, she could hear her family's muffled voices, Thomas insisting she should be sent away, her mother pleading for mercy, her father declaring she would never set foot near the river again. But worst of all was the silence that followed. The silence that meant her fate was sealed. Hours passed. The battle outside had ended, though Eleanor could not know how. Was Dakota alive? Had he fallen where she had seen him stagger? The thought of him lying alone in the forest, wounded or dead, tore at her heart until she could scarcely breathe. She reached into her bodice and drew out the small token he had given her weeks earlier, a carved pendant of bone smoothed by his hands. She held it tightly, the only proof that her love had been real, the only piece of him she had left, but even that, she realized, had betrayed her. Thomas must have seen it before. Perhaps it was what confirmed his suspicions. What her family saw as evidence of her shame was, to Eleanor, the symbol of her freedom. She sank to the floor, the darkness pressing in. Her body trembled with fear, but her heart burned with defiance. She would not give Dakota up, not in her thoughts, not in her soul. They could lock her away, call her traitor, cast her from their hearts. But they could not unmake the truth of what she felt. In the suffocating dark, Eleanor whispered his name like a prayer. Dakota! And with that prayer came a vow. If she ever escaped, she would find him, no matter the cost. The storage chamber was dark and airless, no bigger than a closet. Eleanor sat huddled on the dirt floor, her back pressed to the rough boards, her body sore from the hours of confinement. The single crack of light through the wall shifted as the day faded into night. She had not eaten. She had not slept. But she had thought long and hard. Her father's words still rang in her ears. "You are no daughter of mine." The sting of them had nearly broken her. Yet in that same wound came clarity. If she no longer belonged to her family, if they had cast her out in spirit, then what bond still held her here? Her place was no longer in this house of fear and anger. Her place was with Dakota. If he still lived, the thought of him bleeding, alone, perhaps dying in the woods, spurred her to action. She could not stay here, waiting while her father's hatred and Thomas's suspicion hardened around her like chains. She had one choice left, and it was the boldest she had ever made. She would escape. The bolt on the door was heavy, but it was meant to keep her from leaving quietly, not from leaving at all. She waited until the cabin was silent, the embers in the hearth long cooled, the faint snores of her family carrying through the walls. Then, gathering her courage, she pushed against the door. It groaned softly. She froze, listening, her heart hammering against her ribs. No footsteps. No voices. She tried again, harder this time. The wood strained against the latch. She slipped the edge of Dakota's carved pendant beneath the bolt and jimmied it upward. For a long, breathless moment, nothing happened. Then, with a faint metallic click, the bolt lifted. Eleanor exhaled shakily. She pushed the door open just wide enough to slip through. The cabin lay in darkness, her family asleep in their rooms. She moved like a shadow, her bare feet silent on the wooden floor. When she reached the door, her hand trembled on the latch. This was the point of no return. Beyond this door was exile. Beyond this door was freedom. She opened it. The night air was cold and sharp, filled with the scent of pine and distant smoke. The moon hung high, silvering the fields and the forest beyond. Eleanor ran. Her skirts caught on weeds, her breath tore from her lungs, but she did not stop until the settlement was behind her. At the river, she paused only long enough to catch her breath. The waters reflected the moonlight, the current whispering against the stones. It was here that her life had changed. It was here that she had met him. And it was here that she prayed she would find him again. "Dakota," she whispered into the night, her voice trembling. "Where are you?" For a moment, only silence answered. Then, faintly, a rustle in the trees. Eleanor's heart leapt. She turned, scanning the shadows. From the forest, a figure emerged. Tako. He limped slightly, his arm bound with a strip of cloth stained dark. But he was alive. Alive. Relief and joy flooded Eleanor so strongly that she nearly collapsed. She ran to him, and when his arms closed around her, the rest of the world fell away. "You should not have come," he said, his voice rough with pain and something deeper. Yet he held her tightly, as though he could not let go. "I had no choice," she whispered against his chest. "They found out. They locked me away. I would rather die here with you than live another day in that prison." For a long moment he said nothing. Then he pulled back, searching her eyes. "You know what this means. If you stay with me, you cannot go back. Not to your family. Not to your people. They will hunt you." "I know." Her voice was steady now, clearer than it had ever been. "But I have already lost them. You are all I have left. You are all I want." His hand rose, brushing gently across her cheek. In the moonlight, his expression was solemn yet tender. "Then we run," he said. "Together." And so they did. Hand in hand they vanished into the trees, leaving behind the river, the settlement, the family that had cast her out. Ahead lay only uncertainty, danger, pursuit, perhaps death. But also hope. Hope for a life beyond boundaries. Hope for love that no chains could hold. For the first time, Eleanor felt the weight of fear lift from her shoulders. She was no longer the obedient daughter of Jonathan Whitfield. She was Eleanor Wilde, free and unafraid, and she was his. The forest swallowed them as they fled, branches tearing at Eleanor's skirts, roots catching her boots, the cold night air burning in her lungs. Yet she did not falter. Takota's hand gripped hers tightly, his strength pulling her onward. Behind them, the settlement was alive with shouts. The alarm had been raised. Lanterns bobbed in the dark, dogs barked, and the metallic clatter of rifles echoed through the trees. Her family would not let her go quietly. By dawn, their pursuers had closed the distance. Takota led her higher into the mountains, where the land grew rocky and the air thin. His wounds slowed him, though he never complained. Eleanor saw the strain in his face, the way his jaw clenched as he pushed forward. Each time she begged him to rest, he shook his head. "They will not stop," he said grimly. "Your brother will not stop." She knew he was right. Thomas's pride, her father's fury, both burned too hot to let them simply disappear. The settlement would see her flight as betrayal, and Takota as the enemy who had stolen her. Only blood would quench that fire. At last, they reached a narrow ridge overlooking the valley below. The forest stretched out like a sea of gold and green, autumn light catching in the leaves. For a moment, it almost seemed peaceful, but then voices rose from the slope behind them. "They're close," Eleanor whispered, panic clawing at her throat. Takota glanced around quickly, his sharp eyes measuring the terrain. "This is where we stand." Her heart lurched. "No, we can still run." He shook his head, calm but resolute. "Not with them at our heels. If we keep running, they will catch us. Here, we fight. Here, we choose." The word choose struck deep. Eleanor realized this was the moment her life balanced upon, between the family who had cast her out and the man she had chosen to love. Between surrender and freedom. She stepped closer, her voice trembling but certain. "Then I choose you." His eyes softened. For a fleeting instant, his hand brushed her cheek, lingering as though memorizing her face. "And I you." The first shot cracked through the trees. Bark exploded from a nearby trunk. Eleanor flinched, but Takota raised his bow with steady hands. From the shadows settlers emerged, Thomas at their head, rifle raised, his face a mask of fury. "Eleanor!" he shouted. Get away from him, now! She stood tall on the ridge, her chest heaving, her skirts torn, her hair wild in the wind. No, she called back, her voice ringing clear. I will not. Thomas's face twisted with rage. He is the enemy. You shame us all. He is my heart, she interrupted, her voice breaking yet unshaken. And I would rather die beside him than live chained to your hatred. A silence fell, heavy as a grave. Then Thomas fired. The bullet tore past her shoulder, close enough to make her stumble. Dakota loosed an arrow in return, striking the rifle from Thomas's hands. Chaos erupted gunfire, shouting, the acrid smoke of powder filling the air. Dakota moved like a hawk, swift despite his wound, arrows flying with deadly precision. Eleanor scrambled for cover, her body trembling. Yet even through her terror, she felt a fierce pride. This was no savage, no demon. This was Dakota, her warrior, her love, but numbers overwhelmed them. Settlers pressed closer, their rifles glinting. Eleanor's heart hammered with dread. A figure lunged toward her, Thomas, his knife flashing. She cried out, stumbling back. Before the blade could strike, Dakota was there. He seized Thomas's wrist, wrenching it aside. The two men struggled, strength against strength, fury against defiance. Eleanor screamed, rushing forward, but she could do nothing. The knife plunged. For a terrible moment, Eleanor did not know who had fallen. Then she saw Dakota stagger, the blade buried in his side. No! Her scream split the air. She caught him as he fell, her arms cradling him, her tears blinding her. Thomas stood frozen, his knife slick with blood, his face pale with shock. Dakota's breath came shallow, his eyes clouded with pain. Yet when he looked at her, there was no fear, only love. His hand rose weakly to brush her cheek one last time. "Eleanor," he whispered, "do not weep. We are free." Her tears fell onto his skin as she pressed her forehead to his. "No. No, stay with me, please." But his eyes closed, his body growing still in her arms. The settlers stood around her, silent, uncertain, their guns lowered. Eleanor lifted her head, her face streaked with tears, her voice fierce as steel. "You call him enemy," she said, her words carrying across the ridge. "But he was braver, kinder, and freer than any of you will ever be. And though you may kill him, you cannot kill what we were." For a moment, no one moved. Even Thomas faltered, his eyes haunted by what he had done. Eleanor bent over Dakota's body, clutching him tightly. Her heart was broken, but in her grief burned something her family could never take away, the knowledge that she had chosen love over fear, truth over lies, freedom over chains. And in that choice, even in death, they had won.